Thank you, Richard. Everybody sit down. All right. Let's get started. So this panel, we have Bridget Welsh, who's been an active member of the Asian Barometer Survey for a long time, and she's a Senior Research Associate Center for East Asian Democratic Studies at NTU and has a variety of other affiliations and teaching capacities. And then we're going to have Kai-Ping Huang, who has also been with the Asian Barometer for a long time, is now teaching at National Taiwan University. Then Lu Jie, who's an associate professor at the Government Department in AU here in DC. They will present in that order, and then we're going to have Constance Steitzen-Muller, who's a fellow here at the Brookings Institution, expert on U.S.-Europe relations, and then we will then all come up here and have the discussion. So, Bridget, thank you.
Slides come. Here we are. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back here in Washington, D.C. in Brookings. And we'd like to thank Richard Bush and the Center for East Asian Policy for their kind invitation and sponsoring this, along with the other sponsors of the program. I always, when Andy is introducing people a long time, as you get older, that takes on special meaning, as I'm sure you know. So one starts to feel one's age. But here we go, as the slides eventually do come. So today, we're looking at a whole range of questions in our survey of the Asian Barometer. And earlier on, in the earlier panel, my colleagues focused specifically on the questions that looked at favorability of the U.S. and China, and the narrow range of those questions. We have another question that we're going to focus on today, and with Kai-Ping and myself, and that looks specifically at a measurement we think is a good proxy, although not the only proxy, for looking at assessments of soft power. We ask in the survey whether or not, which country do you think you should follow as a model for development? And what we're doing in the sessions in the next few minutes is to look at the answers of those who said chose the United States and those who chose China, essentially as two different proxy measures for the level of soft power of these two respective countries. And they can choose other countries, and they choose Japan, they choose Singapore, they choose their own country, but we are focusing specifically on the differences and those who chose the US and China, because we think when you choose that as a model, that really indicates that you have a lot of attachment to that specific country, and it's a very, I think, interesting and very useful measure for questions of soft power. Now, here are some of the questions that we're looking at. I need to actually switch because I think what's happened is that they've put my Kai-Ping slides up first. Let me find them. Here we are. One always should glance down carefully. It's okay. I've got it. No problem. Here we are. My slides don't seem to be here. So in our slides, what we find is that we actually find some very interesting dynamics. The first of all, the thing that we find is that U.S. still remains the dominant choice compared to China in terms of issues of soft power. It's the slide that says contesting soft power. We sent two slides to. The other thing that we find in looking at this issue is that there are certain countries that are actually increasingly looking more attention to China. And that number is growing. And we compare that between the first and second wave. No, because ours is connected. Can you hand me my purse? I decided to, so I also have the slides on the USB. Just in case. Sorry about this. It happens. No problem. I hope this is not going to take away from my time. Given extra time for this. No, I'm just kidding. Here we are. Where's not reading my USB? If I was one of my students, I would have said to them, "Your job is to check beforehand you get up." So I have to berate myself on this. Here we are. Thank you for your kindness, Andy. Here we go. Is it coming? The slideshow? Okay, here we go. There we are. So we're looking at levels and measures of soft power, and then we begin to look in the explanation. So what I'm going to look at are the demographic dimensions, and we're going to pick up a little bit on what was mentioned earlier, which is that we see differences in perceptions of age and other factors. But one of the things I'd like to get across a little bit differently compared to my colleagues this morning, and that is I think that we're starting to see when we look at soft power that the U.S. is really failing to engage lots of citizens across East Asia. And there are gaps, and there are shifts and changings that are taking place. And I think this has a lot to do with the way Obama's administration has actually engaged with East Asia. It's been highly elitist, focusing on having visits and trips, as opposed to focusing on engagement with citizens. And we'll look at this and see where there are these gaps in some meaningful ways. All right, so because I think many of us think about the region not just as East Asia, but North and versus Southeast Asia, what we're seeing here are the answers to these questions. And so this particular graph basically distinguishes and identifies the number of percentage in those countries that chose the US and China as a respective model. So we know, as we've learned earlier, Japanese do not choose China. So we see that big sharp divide. But we see, for example, that Koreans do, in very high numbers, choose the United States. Some small shares in respective actually choose China. But where the interesting finding here is on Hong Kong, where in fact more people choose China as a model compared to the US. It's not a big difference, but it is an important difference. Now, this is the change over time between the last wave, which was carried out between 2010 and 2013, and the most recent wave. And in most of the areas, as indicated earlier, things haven't really shifted. So in Japan, Taiwan, and Mongolia, we've seen modest shifts, but pretty much inconsistent, not that significant. But where the changes are interestingly in Korea and in Hong Kong. So we're seeing that more people are choosing the United States as a model in Korea compared to the previous wave. And actually, in Hong Kong, more people are choosing China. And this is one of the big takeaways you would have, I think, interestingly enough, is that when we look at places like Hong Kong, we're actually seeing China, in terms of its soft power, gaining ground in very interesting sets of ways. And we'll come to the reasons for that, I think, in a little bit later. Now, the second issue is looking at the same questions in the context of Southeast Asia. And so here, this region sees much more variability. This is not a surprise. Right? We would expect to see that variability. And in fact, there are a lot of consistencies with the previous panel, which asked similar sets of questions. We see, for example, in the Philippines, very large numbers choosing the US as a model. One of the things I find so striking about the Philippines is that they never choose their own model. So it's really quite an interesting set of numbers. And interestingly, Cambodia, the gentleman's question earlier, one of our findings across the board about the Cambodia findings is that there is very high support for the United States compared to China, which of course is the opposite of what the government is doing. The government has a very pro-China policy. So there is a disconnect between the government's policy and the policy of the views of the citizens. So we see those different numbers. Also, Vietnam. Look at Vietnam. In terms of only 2% choose China as a model compared to 30% choosing the United States. Again, sharp variations in this context. So we see strong US support as one pattern. Then we see quite even splits. Singapore is a good example of an even split in that type of area. Similar, we see a dynamic that is evolving, and I think we're seeing this trend in places like Malaysia and Thailand, where there is more support for China as a model than the United States. And the earlier conversation by Yoon Han was that this has to do with the Muslim societies. I think it's a bit more complicated than that, and I want to get into some of those variables in a little bit. In even split, we also see Indonesia. So this gives you a sense of that. And of course, in Myanmar, there is a much more pro-US position than China as well. So variability in these three patterns. Now, here's the changes over time in the last five years, right? Another important takeaway that we see here is that there is a contraction of support in Indonesia. Indonesia was supposed to be Obama's success story. He lived in Indonesia. And what I think one of the implications of this is that the survey research showed that there wasn't effective capitalization. By the way, he wasn't born in Indonesia. Just as a point of clarification. But it is an interesting dimension because this, I would say, is one of the lost opportunities of the administration. And I think something that is a wake-up call for the next administration because Indonesia is such an important regional power and global power. Keep in mind, it is part of the G20. All right, we see loss of advantages in Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand. Here, again, one of the issues to emphasize is that in parts of Southeast Asia, US soft power is contracting. And in many core members of ASEAN, Malaysia, Thailand, and Singapore, this is where it's happening. And this is the battleground for contesting soft power in the region. And it's actually one that the US, I believe, is losing. But there are some bright spots, and that has, in the context from the perspective of the US, Cambodia and Vietnam, we have very important gains in terms of perceptions of choosing the US as a model, and I think this is a very interesting dynamic, but not as large as quite a big difference in the context of Vietnam. And of course, that's been exacerbated by a lot of the security concerns and China's policy on the South China Sea and other areas. So we also asked the question, well, who is it that is actually taking these different perspectives? Why are they taking them? So the first cut on this is to look at demographic factors. So we see, generally, as has been supported earlier, younger East Asians are more likely to choose the United States over China as a model. We're also finding that in urban areas and among wealthy populations, they are less likely to choose the United States. This is a very important point, right? That means the US, people who choose the US as a model are in the rural areas and poorer. Not exactly the composition from a perspective of the US of who you want to be supporting you as a model. And in fact, the political elite classes are not choosing the US, they're choosing China. And ironically, one of the things is that the US policy towards the region has been centered on elites, on political elites. And in fact, they're not winning them to the same degree, especially in those areas that we would actually, in the urban areas or wealthier groups of populations. And we look at this. Here is the graph that looks at the issues of youth. And there are generally, as I said, the trend is that young people, and you can see those things go down in this direction, slightly higher youth, adult, and elderly. But the youth advantage is not huge. And in fact, there are a couple interesting exceptions, which I think I wanted to point out. The first exception is the Philippines. The Philippines has really high levels of support for the US in terms of soft power, but it's not necessarily among young people. And it's interesting to watch the impact of the Duterte presidency because he won a lot of support among young people. He's using ethnic language, nationalist fervor. It's actually gaining ground, especially among young people. And it will be interesting to see how that translates. So we see, and also in Korea. Also, we see that older people tend to be much more in the US, choosing US as compared to China. So what does this all mean? What are the implications so far of this particular answer? Right? That in the most contested region of soft power, the United States is not winning, as I mentioned earlier, particularly in places like Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand. And this is the shift and changes over time. That Indonesia's policy has not really translated in the citizens at large. And I think this speaks to a gap in terms of the engagement with the region. And in fact, the gains are the places where China is. And this implications of this is China is its own worst enemy, in the sense that it's actually having backfire effects in places like Cambodia and in places like Vietnam. In Northeast Asia, US position remains much stronger than that of Southeast Asia. And one of the things for someone like myself who works on Southeast Asia foreign policy and issues, what we're seeing in the context of Southeast Asia is that one of the challenges has been the administration continues, and administrations continue to look at Southeast Asia as a competition with China, not looking at Southeast Asia itself as a region. And this is where the battlegrounds are gaining, and also where we're seeing important shifts that are taking place. Citizens are not necessarily being engaged adequately. And I think this is an important wake-up call for US policy in the new administration. I'll stop there.
Okay, so good morning. So I'm going to talk about why more East Asians choose choose U.S. model over China model, and actually to analyze this one. Sorry, it's not. Okay, to analyze this question, actually I think because U.S. still outperforms China in every aspect. Including politically, economically, and culturally. So here, I'm not going to talk about why there are so many people choose the U.S. over China model, but rather where there is narrowing gap between the preference of China and U.S. model. And I think to ask this question is most sensible because what the U.S. policymakers should be concerned with is where those gap is narrowing instead of widening. And so, so here we are going to talk about in different regions whether different factors can explain the variation across those regions. And so the first one we want to ask is about whether trade matters. And if we look at Northeast Asia, and so you can see that actually the horizontal line is the trade between the difference in trade between the U.S. and China. Actually, most countries in Asia have more trade volumes with China than with the U.S. And the vertical line is actually the difference between choosing the U.S. and China. So actually, we know that actually more people tend to choose the U.S. over China. And so here we can see that the regression line actually is negative, which means when you trade more with China, you actually will choose less, you will choose the US less. So which means you will have a narrowing gap between the US, between choosing the US and China. But the research is actually more about Hong Kong. And so as we talked about before, actually Hong Kong has very special relationship with China. and it depends a lot on China economically and politically. But if we take out Hong Kong, actually the regression line is positive, which means in Northeast Asia, trade more with China actually get to wider gap between choosing US and China. So they trade more with China, but they actually tend to choose US more. But how about Southeast Asia? So Minhua has already mentioned that Asia economy, China's economic influence is actually a very important factor in this region. But that's not the case in Northeast Asia, but it is the case in Southeast Asia. So when we look at this graph, actually when people trade, for countries in Southeast Asia, when they trade more with China, they actually, the preference between choosing US and China actually gets narrow. But of course, we have two outliers, that is the Philippines and Vietnam. And as we just discussed before, so these two countries have territorial disputes with China, and so that maybe affect how, affect that they actually tend to choose US more over China. Okay. And so across the region, actually protectionism is widespread. But here in Northeast Asia, we see that protectionism doesn't affect much between choosing US and China, except in Hong Kong, I think, and also Japan. But in Southeast Asia, there's not much differences. The big differences only happen in Myanmar and Vietnam and Singapore. And something interesting is for those who chose China model, actually fewer of them are actually protectionist, which means actually protectionist Southeast Asians tend not to choose China as a model, and which also means maybe they think that China's economies might pose some kind of challenge or threat to their own economies. Okay, so then we have to ask, then why people in Northeast Asia don't want to choose China as a model? So then we look at another factor, that is whether values matter, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in Southeast Asia, as we just discussed. Asia trade can explain more accurate about why between the preference between China and the U.S. But so in this case, we can see that actually the line is negative, which means for those countries who possess higher level of democratic values, they actually, the gap between choosing U.S. and China is actually pretty narrow. But I have to point out, this line is almost due to the Philippines. So the Philippines has very low level of democratic values, but they have huge gap between choosing the U.S. and China. So if you take out the Philippines, actually you can see the line there. It's a little bit, it's probably just a flat line there. So which means democratic values doesn't explain much about choosing US and China in Southeast Asia. But how about Northeast Asia? It does matter. So the regression line is positive, which means countries with higher levels of democratic values, they actually tend to choose the US more as a model against China. And we have outlier there, that is Taiwan. But Taiwan, I have to say that actually in Taiwan, actually a lot of people choose Japan as the first model. So if you count Japan as something similar to the US model, then you actually will see that Taiwan will be closer to the regression line. Okay, so whether support matters, support for democracy matters, it does matter in Northeast Asia. As you can see, the regression line is positive. How about in Southeast Asia? In Southeast Asia, okay, so the line is negative, but it's also, again, due to the Philippines. But Philippines is a special case here. But if we take out the Philippines, the regression line actually is negative, is positive, which means for countries who support democracy, they also tend to choose the US model more than choosing China as a model. Okay, so I think Yunhan already covered this. So we know that positive view is usually high. I mean, positive view toward the U.S. in the region is usually higher than positive view toward China's impact on the region. And so the exception is in Hong Kong. And in Southeast Asia, we can see that actually, from the Philippines, you have very high percentage of positive view toward the U.S., but then toward Cambodia and then Singapore, that's all still okay. But when you go to Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, then the percentage actually flip. So you actually have more people who have positive views toward China than toward the U.S. Okay, so at the individual level, we also run some analysis, but I'm not going to delve into these boring numbers. So I will just give you the summary of the findings. Okay, so trade flow matters in Southeast Asia, but not in Northeast Asia. And protectionist views was high across the region, but even protectionist East Asians support the U.S. model. But we also have some exceptions in Myanmar, Singapore, and Vietnam. East Asians who possess democratic values were more likely to choose the U.S. over China model. East Asians who possess traditional values were more or less likely to choose the U.S. over China model. Then this is a very interesting finding. But we just mentioned before, wealthier East Asians or urban East Asians, they actually tend not to choose the U.S. as a model. So maybe this elite engagement failed in those countries. And this one actually says that because we know that wealthy people, urban residents, they tend to hold liberal values. I mean, traditional liberal values. But so here it also indicates maybe policy concern should shift to other dimensions. So East Asians who support democracy also support the U.S. model to a greater degree than China. And East Asians who perceive the U.S. influence in the region positive, they also tend to choose U.S. model over China. And so, of course, we have some exceptions later, but different patterns in Hong Kong, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, these are the places where U.S. is losing its soft power. So our policy implications are like, U.S. policies should shift away from trade, because I think the advantage of the U.S. is actually values, especially the promotion of democracy, human rights, and good governance to some extent in the region. And this is also the area that the U.S. policymakers should consider besides elite engagement, maybe there should be more non-elite engagement in the region, especially in Southeast Asia. And so U.S. soft power cannot be taken for granted, and because it's shifting. So underlying factors accounting for views not being addressed adequately. So it should be addressed adequately in policy. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the invitation. So the first panel and the two panelists of this panel generally talks about the choice between US model and China model, especially among Asian people. Now, my side job is to talk about the role of US model among Chinese citizens. This actually for me is a very important and interesting topic. First of all, if we're talking about a competition between US model and China model as a sort of competition of soft power, one major concern will be how do Chinese people view that, right? I mean, this is sort of like the big, sort of most important battleground, not for US, but also for the CCP regime, as to say, how they can attract people to different camps or different ideas of governance. The second issue has some sort of historical longitudinal implication I believe some of you still remember the Statue of Liberty raised in the Tiananmen Square in 1989 as a symbol that proposed by students as an ideal goal for their strive for democracy. Then after so many years, people are still concerned about Chinese people's general views of democracy as a potential model for their future development. And this not has implications for the competition regarding soft power, but always huge implications for the so-called prospect for democracy in China. So this is what I'm going to address using the ABS model collected from mainland China. This will be the major sort of outline of today's presentation. We're going to talk a little bit of a debate on the China model versus the US model, especially within the domestic politics content within China. Then I'm going to show you some of the public opinion data and the models that the Chinese people prefer for the future development of mainland China. Then we're going to say what makes the US model really appealing to the Chinese people. I know many of you have concerns because we talk about the China model, US model, sort of monolithic concept. This is kind of black box. We never unpack that. But in practice, it's actually very difficult for you to ask people why you like the US model. I mean, the only thing we can do is try to infer why people like this model based on some sort of correlation analysis. For instance, if you think they prefer the US model because of rule of law, then your expectation will be those people who think the rule of law in China is really bad and would like to choose the US model. So use that kind of correlation analysis, try to work like a forensic anthropologist, right? You have a skeleton and to figure out what's the underlying story. So this is what we do with the public opinion data by correlation analysis. So then we use this kind of data to generate some conclusions, implications for public policy. So that's first to see a few words about so-called US versus China model. It's primarily building on a political discourse within China to see US model primarily been presented liberal democracy with all these key features which you are familiar with. This is a market economy, and also the key proponents within China will be the right-wing intellectuals as a so-called road leading party in Chinese called them 带路党, which means lead China to the US model, right? Well, on the China side, we see this generally presented as so-called socialism with Chinese characteristics, intentionally using some of the sort of terms used by the CCP to see it's a regime characterized by the dominance of CCP with so-called multi-party cooperation and consultation. But some people call these parties pseudo-parties. There are kinds of debates there. It's rule by law instead of rule of law. And this is actually a key component emphasized by the current administration. It's in the literature, it's being characterized as a one-party regime. And when it comes to the economy side, we see this is a market economy, but with significant intervention and regulation from the state. And this is a little bit different from the American model with a key role played by the government. There are also proponents for this kind of China model for the future development, primarily the left-wing intellectuals, and also we have those people who enjoy this kind of discussion, call them 50-cent party, 五毛党, or even 自干, those people won't receive 50 cents from the party, but volunteer to do this kind of job for the promotion. So this is a general setting of so-called debate of the US versus China model within China, right? Then what kind of responses from people? So we have two waves of surveys that in mainland China talking about which country you think should be the model for our future development. There are a little bit sort of difference in terms of wording. I'll talk about this, but let's show the data first. So clearly we'll say around 25% of Chinese people, this is a national probability sample, choose US as the model for their future development. And this percentage has been quite consistent and stable across years. So one wave down in 2015, one wave 2011, 4 years in between. This is quite consistent. And over the years, you see Singapore appears to be a more attractive model for China's future development. The percentage increased from around 15% to 18% in 2015. What is most interesting is about our own models here. In 2011, close to 17% of respondents choose our own model should be followed for our future development. While in 2015, it's around 3 or 4%. People say, what's the big difference? There's a big difference in terms of the answer category provided for them. In 2011, our own model was intentionally presented as a category for them to choose. While in 2015, that category was not read to the respondents. But if they choose, we should follow our model, where we call it, we should follow our model. Which means in 2011, our own model theoretically is the politically correct answer, right, that you should take. And so many people choose our own model. But if you drop that category, say, we just code our own model. If you volunteer, say, we should follow our model, there's a big difference, a significant change. But a more interesting finding here is, regardless whether you present China as a choice for the people, that doesn't affect their choice over the United States. Right? So you have two different answer categories between 2011 and 2015. But the choice of the United States as a future model for development is really stable and consistent, around 26–25%. And what's more interesting here, I mean, for the first panel, many people talk why shouldn't we ask people about different dimensions of influence? There's a huge percentage giving you decay. They have no idea. They don't know. This is not unique for this question. When you check many people's responses to questions, typing their, for instance, international knowledge, typing their attitudes, foreign affairs, generally you see a high percentage of decays. Because remember, this is a national representative sample, right? As we said, we cover all people from China, from both urban areas, rural areas, people with different sort of exposure to the news and information. So given this pattern, how to explain that? Why we have very persistent, robust, close to 26–27% of people choose US as their model? There are some sort of theoretical conjectures, right, we can take to see why they choose the American model. There's kind of argument on say they choose the US model based on rational reflections of the disadvantages and advantages of different types of models. This kind of rational argument assumes, first, people have sufficient information to both models, right? You have enough information to make valid assessments of the different models, then you can choose which one is better for China. And also, there are some key issue domains that we suppose these people should focus on, because these key issue domains are the key differences between the China model versus the US model. For instance, we're talking about rule of law, checks and balances, electoral politics. If we focus on the political domain, if we focus on economic domain, will be economic prosperity, including institutionalized protection, property rights, things like that. And the general expectation will be, if you follow this kind of rational argument, those people who have more negative views of China on all these aspects we mentioned should theoretically be expected to take the US model more likely, right? So if it's purely based on rational elections. The second is, it's not based on fully rationalized reflections and calculations, but more like sort of idealize the goal for our future development, but with very limited specific reflections. So US model folks like something that's ideal that we want to achieve, but for those people, they have some sort of knowledge about the US, but not sufficient knowledge for very comprehensive rational evaluations, and they do not pay specific attention to those specific issue domains that we talked about. So their evaluation of the US model is not about US performance in rule of law, constitutional rule, democracy, protection of human rights, liberty, but more about US is something good. This is called idealized goal with limited specifications. Another approach is simply, it's not a consensus, just a random response from people who say, I just pick US model. This could be another plausibility to explain people's choice for the US model. And with this, you would expect those people with very limited information about the US model, because they have no idea, right, what the US model should be. And also, there should be no specific correlates with their choice of the US model. So these will be some sort of expectations based on how you model people's cognitive process of choosing the US model when confronted with that kind of choice between US and China. Then let's see some sort of empirical evidence to see which one or which approach, which model may be more plausible. So this is the first thing on the frequency of Chinese people following international foreign affairs. This is the first indicator we use to try to capture people's exposure to related information for rational assessments. Where you see across time, it's close to 40–50% of people, they follow international news and foreign affairs quite often or all the time. You would argue that this will be the relative percentage of Chinese people with enough information to make comprehensive and rational assessments, right? Which means another half of the people actually don't have that kind of information to make assessment about the US model. There's another thing about, we in this question ask people to assess the democratic quality in different countries' societies, asking their assessment of Taiwan, India, Japan, United States, and China. These are the percentages of missings when we ask them for their assessment of democratic quality in these specific countries. Whereas when asked to assess democratic quality in China, the missing is 20%, which is not huge. But when you push Chinese people to see how democratic do you think the US is, missing percentage is close to 55%. The missing in this question is, again, many people do not have enough information to make valid assessments. Hopefully, I have convinced you that when it comes to the access-related information for comparison assessment, we do not have enough evidence to support that kind of fully rational sort of rationalization-based argument. To say their choice between China-US model is based on comprehensive assessments of these two models' performance on key aspects, and which one should be better for China's future. So this is the first sort of information foundation to make that kind of argument. Now, this is the missing values when they assess American democracy by their choice of model. For those who choose US model, there are around 30% do not know the quality of democracy in US. When they choose all these models, close to 50% do not know about the quality of US. When they choose other models, close to 50% do not know about US quality. So comparatively speaking, for those people who choose US models, they know more about the quality of democracy in US. But again, the percentage of missing is still missing. So for those choose US model, close to 30% of people have no idea of the quality of democracy in the United States, right? So this has some implications for, say, how people choose these models. Now, when it comes to specific reflections, we check these dimensions. For instance, how people perceive the economic performance in China in both national terms and family terms over the years and in the future and concurrent. So these are current, retrospective, prospective evaluations. For the political performance, we choose people's assessments of rule of law in China, the checks and balances politics in China, more here about sort of National People's Congress of supervising the administrative power, and we also check their assessments of Chinese government's responsiveness, as well as the effectiveness of Chinese elections in making people accountable. So theoretically, if you think people's choice of American model is based on full rational assessments of the US model, all these negative assessments should be highly correlated with their choice of the American model, right? They don't like the situation in China. They believe the US model should be better. That's why they choose US model. But when we do this very comprehensive statistical modeling, the modeling could be more complicated because we have huge missing values. So we run this kind of selection model, which is not something that you will be interested in, right? But I just give you the results. If you believe me, I've been crunching data for many years, and the result is they all fail. So no matter which aspect you focus on, people's assessments of these key dimensions are statistically insignificant relationship with their choice of American model. Which means, again, we do not have sufficient evidence to say these people choose US model based on comprehensive rational evaluations assessments of the two models. Now it comes to what really matters, right? So when it comes to the democratic assessments, we ask people to assess democratic quality in US, democratic quality in China. Then can compare which one for them is more democratic. Again, the missing values are significant across years, 50%. Close to 25 to 30% believe US is more democratic than China, if you think this will be rational people, right? Well, around 5 to 8% of people believe China and US equally democratic. Well, close to 15% of respondents believe actually China is more democratic than the US. Now, we can take this as some sort of indicator. If you believe US is more democratic than China, then you should prefer US model if you really emphasize the perfects of democracy in China, right? If you believe China is more democratic than the US, then why do you care about the US model? This will be, so we take a difference between their evaluations, US quality, democracy and Chinese democracy. The difference ranges between negative to positive. Well, negative stands for they think China is more democratic, while the positive values they think US is more democratic. So you find those people who believe US is more democratic actually more like to choose US model. And those people who find China is more democratic are more like to see we should follow our own model for democratic choices. So this is one general feeling about democracy in China may have some relationship with our choice of the US model. This is one indicator we find statistically significant in our rounds of regressions. The other general feeling is about life satisfaction. We have a 10-point scale to measure life satisfaction, with 1 as the lowest satisfaction, with 10 as the highest satisfaction. We'll see those people who are more satisfied with their life in China, actually they are less likely to choose US as their model for future development. And those people who are more satisfied with their life in China, more likely to choose our own model for future development. That also has some implications, but again, this measure is a very general measure about people's feelings, right? It's not about specific aspects or dimensions of China's performance. So have 2 general feeling measures that matters. First is about situation of democracy in China. Second is about your life satisfaction in China. There are some sort of information access also matters. This captures people's news consumption in China, primarily domestic news media. What you will find is, for those people who consume news more, actually they are less likely to take the US model as a choice. This has some implications, for instance, for propaganda, right? For indoctrination, for how Chinese people manipulate this kind of information flow to shape people's understandings. What is very interesting about this information access is people with more consumption of domestic media actually more likely to choose Singapore. This is also compatible with the public discourse, right? But Singapore is presented as one-party government with high transparency, low corruption, right? High efficiency. So this is something they really want. And it seems that the propaganda or the information manipulation has worked to some extent. So this is one measure that matters. Another one is something which is not surprising given previous presentations. After controlling for their life satisfaction, assessment democracy, information exposure, young people still on average more like choose US model for their future development. So we have taken away life satisfaction, assessment democracy, information access, excluding the influence of these factors, still found young people on average more like to choose US models for the first choice. So this has some implications for the so-called generation shift, with implications for values, maybe norms, their views of the world, things like that. But how to unpack that? We need more data, right, to do the further analysis. Another interesting factor we have is about education. So generally, you would argue, if you still remember the image of Statue of Liberty raised in Tiananmen Square in 1989, you would highly educated people more likely to prefer US as a model for future development. Actually, after accounting for all the other factors, you find US model is more attractive among those people with primary education with less than primary education, as compared to those people with higher education. For people with high education in China, Singapore model or our own model actually more attractive. So what does it mean? Higher education means higher sophistication for political decision making. But it also means more experience in the education system in China, which means more exposure to potential political ideological campaigns education. So how that captures underlying dynamics is not interesting that we need to engage. Just do not take it for granted that college students are more likely to favor the US over China. This is not the case, according to the data. Then the preliminary conclusions, again, there are many things we could do with the data, but this is based on very preliminary analysis of data, say, in China we found a sort of moderate preference for the US model. Remember, consistently 25, 26%. But this is against the percentage close to 50 with missings, right? People don't know, they have no idea which model should be chosen. And all the data suggests there are very limited role of rational reflections of China's own problems. When it comes to choice of US model, they're not correlated with people's perceptions of all key major economic political aspects of the Chinese government, but primarily related to what? General views of the USA, PRC, democratic disparity, general feelings of life satisfaction. What a potential interpretation of those people who are not satisfied with their life in China, right? They want to take alternative model, And that model should be sufficiently different from China. And which one is sufficiently different from China? I mean, US could be choice. That is not based on, again, very comprehensive rational assessments of these two models' advantages and disadvantages. Again, we see there's a significant lack of related information for people to make assessments and rationalize their choice. So among those people with sufficient information, you can find an intriguing role played by education, right? Education increases people's capability for making decisions, increase their cognitive sophistication, but also in China's context, more opportunities for propaganda and ideological campaigns. So how to tease out this kind of very nuanced dynamics within education is not an interesting thing. And they have very limited rational reflections of the US model, and maybe we should talk more about the potential role played by the Chinese government in promoting the so-called China model among the Chinese people. So thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Can we turn this off? Thank you. Good morning. My name is Constanze Stelzenmüller. I'm a fellow at Brookings in the Center on the US and Europe, and I am, to those of you who don't know my biography and those who do, very obviously the outlier in this workshop, because I'm not a specialist on China, East Asia, or their relations with the United States. I'm a specialist on my own country, Germany, on Europe and transatlantic relations. I am, however, a human rights and international law. That's my background, and I used to be a journalist, and I worked for Die Zeit, which may be familiar to some of you as a paper once published by Helmut Schmidt, who, as some of you may know, was very good friends with Lee Kuan Yew, and therefore had very strong views on things like Asian values and collective rights and responsibilities. And that led to, among other things, my newspaper once publishing a Singaporean government initiative called the Declaration on Human Responsibilities. I don't know whether any of you have ever heard of that. That was an attempt to circumscribe the reach and impact of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. It's the only government initiative I have ever actually, as a journalist, actively tried to sabotage. And I won't bore you with that, but that I do take a strong interest in questions of our relationship with East Asia and efforts to achieve democratic transformation and liberal governance there. The other reason why I'm standing up here, I think, is that I once used to run a survey and presented it for many years. That was the German Marshall Fund's Transatlantic Trends, which began life as a European-American survey. We tried very hard, including in my time, to expand it to Asia. But as has been mentioned here several times, including by Bruce Stokes, with whom we worked closely many times, that proved incredibly difficult to do. For one, because the information spaces are so different, because the cultural translation necessary to do this kind of thing, to ask the same kinds of questions in these very different political spaces, is an enormous and very complex undertaking. And also very simply because of the quite extraordinary costs of surveying in Asia. To those of you who've ever tried to do this, you will know what I'm talking about. But I remember that I think we were told that asking 3 to 5 questions in Japan would cost us $100,000. In other words, if you're trying to do something serious, a survey with 20, 30, 40 questions, which is what we were doing with Transatlantic Trends, and in at least 5 countries, you really basically have to set up a meth lab somewhere to be able to finance this kind of undertaking. Anyway, I found this morning's presentations fascinating because I think that they show that there is a great deal of disconnect, not just in our understanding of each other's political spaces, but also between our understanding of what polls can tell us and our government policies, dare I say. The reason that I'm not going to comment on the questions, on the findings or their interpretation, since I've only just heard them this morning, and I think that I would need to look at them more carefully to be able to do that with any credibility. I do want to point out to you, if I may, how this relates to the kind of work that I do and that we do in the Center on the US and Europe. And the first point I want to make is to emphasize just how important doing polls is in the current atmosphere. I think that cannot be overemphasized. We find ourselves, at least in Europe and in the transatlantic space, and I think from what I've seen this morning, this is equally true for the Asian space, in a situation of what has been called post-factual politics, where the public debate space, the agora of public opinion, is overwhelmed by facts, pseudo-facts, distortions and outright lies, produced by social media, but also by government propaganda and outright government interference. You only have to read today's New York Times story about Russian propaganda in Europe to know what I'm talking about. If you haven't read it, I recommend it to you. And the result of that is that we are seeing in Europe a governments on the defensive against populist movements everywhere, fueled by this kind of overwhelmed public debate space. We are seeing this on the American side as well, of course. You will have followed the debate on Monday night. And I think that this emphasizes the need for polls as a tool to understand social attitudes and political preferences, attitudes about each other in a global space that is becoming more and more integrated, where we are mobile as persons, where data are mobile, where assets are mobile, capital is mobile, but we understand less and less about each other, and there is more and more potential for friction. Yeah. So that's my first point. I think that if I had one major policy prescription, it would be that governments and civil society, represented by media or foundations, ought to invest more in polls and into their interpretation. I think that is worth all the money we can throw at it, frankly, because I think that this would help sort through some of the confusion. Already, much of what I've seen this morning, I think, would be helpful in elucidating a great deal of the questions that we have about each other. My second sort of very large and general point is about the policy implications of this. In the world that the academic field that I work in, which tries to formulate potential strategies for Europe and America to work with each other in a world that is shaped by globalization and interdependence, polls are important for providing the connection between representative governance and its policymakers and those who are represented. Again, one of the key phenomena that we're seeing right now is a disconnect of understanding and communication between representative democracy and its electorate. That is, you find elites, policymaking, analytical, political, on the defensive against this on both sides of the Atlantic. And I presume similar things are true of East Asia as well. Because social media give the electorate so much more power to shape the debate space than they've ever had, that is now more important than ever. And if we want to preserve representative democracy against the identitarian temptation and against illiberal temptations, it seems to me that that puts a premium on understanding what people want and what they think. My final point is about the triangular relationship between America, Europe, and East Asia and all this. Europe hasn't been mentioned at all today, but of course Europe and its constituent nations are players, and in some cases key players in this space, And of course, we occasionally collaborate with America, and occasionally we are in competition with it. There is a great deal of acknowledged and unacknowledged friction, and in the end, the ultimate endeavor that I think we should all be pursuing is to prevent that friction from spilling over into actual conflict or all-out war, which today, in some ways, seems more possible than it has been for a very long time. And the best way I've heard the challenge formulated is, oddly, in a paper by two American officers who were staffers for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs a couple of years back, who described the European, American, Asian triangle as a strategic ecosystem. And I think that metaphor is useful for us to consider the implications of our actions and inactions in this field and our ability to understand each other. Because what it means is that an ecosystem is, I think by definition, something that is fragile, that needs to be very carefully managed, where balance is a precious good, and is something that needs to be worked on. And again, I'm going to come back to my very general point. The beginning for that, the beginning and the end all of that, is understanding each other, and that is where polls can play a huge role. Thank you very much. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Those were great presentations. We have about 20 minutes. Let me make a couple comments. I'm not a commentator, but one of the long-standing themes of the Asian Barometer surveys has been that respondents have different understandings of what democracy is. We know that, and we've asked about that in every wave of the survey. We also asked them, I believe, I forget who presented this particular data, but the democracy gap between China and the US as it is assessed by the respondent. We just say, how democratic do you think this country is? But we know that people are assessing this gap on different criteria. So the first book that the Asian Barometer Survey published, How East Asians View Democracy, and later investigations as well are exploring these different concepts of democracy. When Lu Jie, and so now in this panel, we're not so much using the word democracy, we're using the word model, I guess. What was the question in the questionnaire?
Which country would you choose as a model?
As a model. And here it has the same ambiguity as any as we discussed in the first panel. You know, when they speak of the model, what do they mean by that? The political model, the lifestyle model, the economic model, and so forth. And I think we didn't dig into that. But Lu Jie has an idea that we can assess what kind of model does the individual have in mind by looking at some of the correlates, right, of that preference. And I think that's a very promising way to go. But you mentioned economic and political attributes, but a person might have, I liked the comment in the morning panel from somebody over here that by soft power, he thinks it basically means where do you want to send your kid or where do you want to go live. That's not so much caught by your two things of economic, and it might be environment, breathing the air, it might be the educational system, science and technology. So I think that Lu Jie's approach is promising, but it's going to need more work to tease out the idea of the model. And then I thought, when he said that most of the people, they just don't know. And I said to Richard, I said, that's the good news. They're choosing the United States because they don't know anything about the United States. On the other hand, perhaps from a policy point of view, we don't care so much about those people anyway. And so we want to dig into the ones who do know and see what they're choosing the United States for what reason and so forth. And that might bring us to the slide that Kai-Ping didn't show us, the regression model that you passed over very quickly. Would be interesting to look at. So those are just some quick comments. Okay, questions. Richard.
I'd like to address Bridget's discussion of Hong Kong, which I found interesting but puzzling. First of all, it's my recollection that the level of democratic values in a previous Asian Barometer survey was higher than what you showed. And so I don't recollect it for sure, but something's going on there. Second, and more substantively, I think that recent events suggest that the desire for something like the U.S. model may be stronger than was revealed in the survey. The district council elections last year and the recent legislative council elections this year, I think, were a repudiation of China's approach to democratization in Hong Kong and a vote of support for the democratic movement there. Second, I think other polling has shown that the desire for democratic institutions has been very strong for a long time, and I suspect remains strong. If I can make a guess, I would say that perhaps the timing of this particular survey may explain the results that you got. And I just checked with Yun Han. The timing was early this year. And if one looks at the United States early this year, that's not a model I would want to adopt either.
Can I answer?
Oh, of course, yeah.
I think I'd like to pick up a little bit of what Bruce said earlier this morning at Pew, and that is, I think timing only affects a marginal perspective. So I think that I would not put as much emphasis on timing as you do, Richard. And we were not presenting democratic values. We were presenting choice of model. In the sense that the democratic values would be quite high, as you indicated. That's another part of the survey. But yeah, and we were looking at a correlation, but we never presented the actual amounts that the Hong Kong people feel about democratic values. But we could provide that for you. But I would say that I do think there is something very important here in Hong Kong, and that is that more Hong Kongers are choosing China as a model over the last 5 years than the U.S., despite what's happening. All right, and the question asks, you have to ask, why is that? And it may not, as Kai-Ping was suggesting, it's not related to democratic values. That's, in fact, not as a factor as it is in other parts of Northeast Asia. But I think it also could be related to U.S. policy towards Hong Kong. And in the sense of whether or not they are supporting aspects of democratic values or how they're engaging with Hong Kong. And I think that raises other sets of questions.
I'm Elliot Hurwitz, a former intelligence community person and the World Bank staff contractor. One of the panelists, thank you very much for a wonderful panel. I really appreciate your information. One of the panelists stated that a country with a higher level of democratic values, countries with a higher level of democratic values, do not have more people choosing the United States. And as far as I heard, there may be a contradiction in that presentation compared with other things that were said. So I would appreciate anyone's comments on that. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Asian democratic values do matter in Northeast Asia, but not so much in Southeast Asia. So in Southeast Asia, we see that choosing China and the US actually is determined mostly by trade volumes. But in Northeast Asia, you will see that when you trade more with China, you actually tend to choose US more as the model. But so in this case, actually, in Northeast Asia, we see the trend that the countries with higher level of democratic values, they actually tend to choose the U.S. So which means trade values cannot explain why they choose the U.S. more, but democratic values do. Thank you.
Hello, I am Yanqi Huang, a visiting fellow in CSIS. And my question is about the definition. Yeah, it's pretty general. Yeah, as we all know, China has been considered as a developing country. And in the near future, I think it will still be a developing country. So what China model really means for people who live in a advanced country like Japan, and what does this factor means in your study? I mean, for the three panelists on my left. Sorry.
I think it is important to unpack why Japanese or other advanced countries might choose China. It's interesting. Japan doesn't choose China, but Singaporeans do. And they have very high level of economic development. So I think that while I agree with you that economic development might be a factor, I think that different people are choosing China for different sets of reasons. And one of the challenges of survey research is we're not able to fully unpack what those reasons are. Some of it may be democratic values, or not, or the lack thereof. Some of it may be the sense that they are the regional power and they want to be with the regional power. Some of it may be about economic relationships and economic opportunities. And I think one of the steps that's necessary to complement polls, which I think are important, is to also do focus groups and other sets of analysis to interpret how some of these things are there. So we are cautious not to over-interpret that. But from what I can tell you from what we see in the data, that being the status of a development doesn't necessarily affect how they view China. It's a combination of factors. That's what we see.
I'd just like to add something. The one point that you didn't mention is something that people also want, I think, generally, is stability and improvement of their general perspective in life. And there are ways in which democracy is associated with more stability, and in some cases people associated with less stability. And I think one of the things that would be worth unpicking in future waves is just what the term means for people, what they associate with it, and what they perhaps fear from it. That in fact is a prerequisite for any kind of thoughtful, coordinated Western policy response.
Well, just okay. I think what my colleague Kai Ping has shown about the relationship between the level of democratic attitude and value, and whether that relate to people might, with higher democratic value might choose American as a model more. I think the macro picture, for ASEAN country, it's not very clear cut, right? It's like flat. But I think if you dig further down to individual level analysis, I think in a lot of countries, including ASEAN country, actually people who subscribe more to democratic value, the higher probability that they also choose the United States as a model. But it's not shown at the macro level, but it has been shown at individual level. So I just want to add that footnote, yeah.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Alexandra Frick with the Stern Group. I have a question for Dr. Huang specifically on Trump's trade policy on China. He has spoken that if he will be elected, he wants to have much more harsh measures. And I think that this will only really increase trade tension and really damage trade relations. I was curious what your opinion would be on if this would have a ripple effect throughout East Asia. I know you said during your presentation that trade has little impact on creating soft power, but I wanted to know what the opposite would be, if Trump's policy would really damage the soft power that we do have.
Yes. You'll never get a visa here again, I'll tell you that.
Depends on who wins.
Okay, so traders matter in Southeast Asia, as we show you, and so but we also show you that protectionist actually can also affect whether people tend to choose the U.S. model or China model, and so I think at least right now in East and Southeast Asia, people tend to think that at least the U.S. is a benign trading partner, not like China, because China in some way has to compare with other countries in Southeast Asia in terms of investment or something like that. And so, we also we can see that for countries who think that China's economic power might be perceived as trade, they actually tend not to choose the China model. So if Trump, should I get into that? If Trump wins, and if he's really tough on that, and so I think that might be have some effect. Impact on whether people would like to choose the U.S. model as well.
We have some questions in the survey that we call ideology about do you favor that the state is more involved in the economy, or do we have a protectionism question? We do, right? Do you think, but this is a question about in our country, like in Malaysia and Indonesia, should we have free trade or less, more? That question we're asking. We're not asking any question about in our survey about should the U.S. have more protectionism, but none of these reports really exploited that battery about people's ideology.
I think, well, one of the challenges is that we found that the U.S. focus on the TPP, which has been the predominant focus in the context of East Asia, especially Southeast Asia, some of the Southeast Asian countries, it's not really translated into soft power. But one has to understand, as I'm sure you do, that the relationship with trade is connected to questions of security, questions of stability, questions associated with perceptions of power dynamics that are shifting. I think if trade policy shifts significantly vis-a-vis Asia, and it's not just China, vis-a-vis Asia, it's going to have a ripple effect on all of the other factors, be it stability, and also it's going to have a ripple effect on perceptions of competition between China and the U.S. in the region itself. So I think one cannot isolate one element to see what the implications are. I think it would be premature for us to say what those views would be in the future, because we don't know. But I think what the survey data has shown us in the past is that these things are interrelated and that they're connected. And I think that one can definitely say that they will have an impact, probably in ways that are greater than what we expect.
Thanks. My name's Yu Hao. I'm a master's student at Georgetown University. This question occurred to me during Lu Jue's presentation, but it's definitely related to other panelists as well. And the question is, you mentioned when you do the survey asking people why is China a model to them, you mentioned a rule by law and regulated by in a regulated market. I think those two are maybe more negative aspects of Chinese government rather than positive. I just wonder, how will you tease out the sort of benevolent or positive factors of Chinese government as compared to the benefits of a democratic system? One example I can think of is Chinese people, they do think their government, although it's not as democratic as the American government, there is a huge level of trust for Chinese people towards their government, and there's also accountability in China's politics, although in the absence of a very functioning democracy. So I wonder how it tease out the factors of a Chinese model.
So first, there's a clarification. I'm not saying that rule by law is a positive aspect of Chinese model. It's just in the political discourse, public discourse. These are the key features people emphasize when they talk about the China model. And to identify whether people identify China model because of rule by law, and the key thing is you ask their assessments of the practice of rule by law in a situation to see how they correlate, which is basic logic we use here. But we do not check the practice of rule by law, but we do check people's assessment of practice of rule of law in China to see how that correlates with their choice of the US model, right? So if you ask US model is attractive because of rule of law, then those people with more negative assessments of rule of law in China should be more likely to choose a US model. So that's the very straightforward logic to argue. But if you find the data, they are not correlated. So again, the information presented here is, in many cases, their choice or preference over the US model is not based on comprehensive rational assessments of different aspects of models, but more like ideological, sort of, and it's related to other audience question about why people choose different models. I mean, the pre-assumption we attach to that, first you need to have some sort of unsatisfaction with the working of the model in your country, right? If you're fully satisfied with how the government performs, and we just go our own way. Then the next question is, if you are not satisfied with how the government works here, what could be attractive to you for an alternative model, right? So that's why we focus on people's very negative sentiment toward varying aspects of Chinese government's performance to see which one could be potentially correlated with our choice of US model. Then you infer that could be potential rationale for that choice. As I said, everything is based on this kind of circumstantial evidence. You cannot directly ask people why you like US model. As I said, many people don't know about a US model. But the trust thing, I think, you must have, since you're from George Washington, Bruce Dickinson has a recent book on that, right? So all kinds of discussions about political trust in China. So he may have more to say on that regard.
I think our last question.
Question is primarily for Bridget. You concluded, I think, that you said U.S. soft power, particularly in Southeast Asia, is contracting, and that this is a wake-up call. My question, I guess, is what is the remedy for that? You made a reference to lack of engagement at the citizens level, but if you could just elaborate on how we address that problem.
I think there are essentially three areas. First of all, U.S. policy in engagement with Southeast Asia has been very much at the elite level, as in we're having a number of people who are visiting along leaders. There's been only a youth program, but that has actually been very ad hoc and not consistently across the board. And so the perception is that the U.S. government is allied with leaders. I mean, Najib and Obama play golf together, while Kelantan is flooding, in the parts of the states of Malaysia are underwater, and the perception is that Obama and Najib are friends. And this type of perception has a resonance in the context of Southeast Asia. The same thing, Clinton and others come to visit Indonesia, and their level of engagement, even in town hall meetings, is actually very minimalist. And most of the visits are very much at the elite level. And I think this is actually a problem, and that there has been a contraction in U.S. governance and U.S. policy towards areas such as VOA, libraries, other aspects of terms of engaging citizens. The public forums are actually contracting. And it's contracting even worse when we have huge numbers and resources put into Confucius centers. So the relative difference is there. The second issue that I think is actually important is that I think the problem with many Southeast Asians feel is that they are in the competition with China, so that it's U.S. policy towards Southeast Asia is about China. It's not about Southeast Asia. And I think that, and it's about the competition of trying to out China, in the context of the region. And so Southeast Asians don't feel engaged as Southeast Asians. They feel that they're caught up in a battle, and that's whether or not that's in the context of the fight over the South China Sea, whether or not it's contestation between Malaysia and China, China and the U.S. over Malaysia policy, the same thing in the context of Thailand. So the second thing is to begin to look at Southeast Asia as something uniquely separate, and importantly is to pick up on something Yoon-Han mentioned earlier, to not see this as a zero-sum game, to see this as something that is actually, there can be two sets of expanding dimensions. It's not us versus them in this particular context. And I think the third factor, and this is that democratic values have really, with the exception of Myanmar, just evaporated from the perspective of U.S. policy towards Southeast Asia. The perception is that they ally with the dictators, as opposed to, and they have left human rights behind. And I said Myanmar is the exception, but it's not the case. There's been very little criticism of the coup in Thailand. Najib and Obama are best friends, and even if he is a kleptocrat in terms of corruption issues, and it's not the Obama administration that's dealing; it's the Justice Department, and they see this as very different. So I think that the traditional allies and in that you have in Southeast Asia, the people who are more democratic, more open, wanting trade liberalization, are actually the ones you're losing the most in Southeast Asia.
Well, thank you to the panelists and to the audience for your questions, and Richard will give us a benediction.
Thank you very much, Andy. Thank you for chairing. As I said before, I think we've had a very rich discussion, and as the last comment clearly suggested, raised some sort of fairly profound issues about U.S. policy, and so it's a good programmatic agenda for whoever takes over our complicated democratic system. So thank you all for coming, and thanks to everybody in Yunhan's group. Thank you, Yunhan.